Hey there, everyone. This is Jess, and I'm going to try something new. I'm going to try making a commentary video. Just recently, Jordan Peterson had a conversation with Douglas Murray, and in the conversation, the book of Job came up. So I want to play the clip and add some comments and tell you what I think. So let's see how this goes. So this is a conversation, and it's about 10 and a half minutes in.
Touches on part of the reason that you laid out for ingratitude, the way you conceptualized it to begin with, say, talking about walking down the streets of New York, being unable to compare that with anything outside of New York. Absolutely. In this present. So ignorance is actually one problem, is that if you don't know anything about history, and there's also, I suppose, as well as ignorance, there's willful blindness and the unwillingness to put in the effort that it would require to be grateful.
Absolutely.
So, I've been considering the book of Job in some depth recently, and it's a very interesting book, and it pertains to purpose, I would say. So by the time the book of Job is written and eventually introduced into the biblical corpus, there's a real transformation in the conceptualization of God. And
I think this is pretty much Jung's take on the book of Job. Jung is he's tracking the transformation of God through the idea of God throughout human consciousness, throughout history, and for Jung wrote a whole book on the book of Job, and his whole thesis is that this was like a turning point in the conceptualization of God. And so what I've heard, there was an old Maps of Meaning lecture that Peterson had where he went through the book of Job, and he goes through it just to tie it to the old myth that he's told a lot of times. And if you're familiar with Peterson's Maps of Meaning stuff, he tells the myth of Marduk and Tiamat, and so he's tying aspects of the book of Job, especially Leviathan there at the end, and to the creation myth of Marduk and Tiamat. Anyway, but other than that, I haven't heard Peterson talk about the book of Job, and so this whole thing piqued my interest. And anyway, this idea of God transforming is very Jungian.
There's a key figure in that transformation, which is extraordinarily interesting. And the figure is Elijah. Mm-hmm. So when Christ is...
Okay, so why does Elijah come up here? It's because of Elihu. Elihu in the book of Job is that, if you remember, there's actually three friends. They go through these cycles of conversations, speeches, and then at the very end, a fourth guy shows up, a young man named Elihu, and his name is very similarly spelled to Elijah. And so, and Elijah, especially for Christians, Elijah is the one who prepares the way for the Lord, and John the Baptist kind of fills that role in the New Testament as an Elijah figure that prepares the way. Now, Elihu also prepares the way for the Lord in the book of Job in an interesting way, because he's the last person to speak before God. So in that sense, he's preparing the way for God. But he also delivers the last quarter of his speech. So I think he speaks for 4 chapters. And the last chapter of Elihu's speech is just him talking about the coming storm, the coming whirlwind that God eventually speaks out of. So Elihu is speaking about the thunder and the wind and the rain that's coming toward Job, that eventually God is speaking out of. So in that way, Elihu kind of has this Elijah type role. So I think that's why Peterson is bringing up Elijah in connection with the book of Job.
transfigured on the mount, two prophets appear with him. One is Moses, and that's obvious why that is. But the other is Elijah. And Elijah, compared to Moses, is a relatively minor figure. And so there's some chapter or some verses devoted to his story, but not a lot. But here's the key psychological significance, let's say, of Elijah. So Elijah set himself up against Jezebel, who was a queen at that time, a foreign queen of Israel, who had introduced the worship of Baal into the Israeli culture. And Baal was a nature god. And so Elijah has a famous dispute with the prophets of Baal and ends up with Yahweh's help defeating them. And so he establishes supremacy over Baal.
This is a golden calf.
Yeah. He builds an altar. He builds an altar and challenges the prophets of Baal to have the sacrifice destroyed by their God, and that doesn't happen. And then he calls on Yahweh, who sends down fire to destroy not only the sacrifice, but the altar itself. And then he has the prophets of Baal put to death, which doesn't exactly thrill Jezebel. And then he runs away because she's after him. And this is where the radical transformation occurs. So he's hiding out in a cave, and he feels he's the only one left who's still an acolyte of Yahweh in the entire, Israelite polity. And a thunderstorm happens, a very, very violent thunderstorm, followed by a very violent earthquake. And Elijah realizes that God is not in the earthquake and not in the thunder, that he is instead the still small voice. That's where that phrase comes from. So it's the first marked internalization of the notion of the deity, is that whatever the highest deity is something that you can commune with internally, that is roughly equivalent, let's say, to the voice of conscience. And so that's Elijah. Right. It's amazing. Now, what happens in Job is so interesting, because in the story of Job, God has a bet with Satan. It's a very nasty story, right?
It's the most brutal story.
It's a brutal story. It's a brutal story. It makes you wonder why it wasn't edited out of the biblical corpus.
And the consolation at the end isn't much of a consolation.
I was just talking with my dad the other day and I was like, I'm amazed that the book of Job is in the Bible, because you'd think if anyone along the line wanted to consolidate power and edit out any problematic texts, and it seems like Job would be the first one to hit the cutting room floor. But it's I'm still amazed that Job got written, for one, and then Job is in the Bible too. It's a miracle.
Exactly. And so Job is a good man, and God thinks so, and so does Satan. And Satan is invited by God to have a few words with him and says, I bet you that I can destroy the faith of your good man, Job. And God says, yeah, I don't think so. Have at her, buddy. And so Job loses everything, and in the most painful possible manner. And what he does, as far as I can tell, is that he uses that internal guide of conscience, which was now, say, allied with the voice of God in some sense, against these terrible external forces that are conspiring to bring him down, right? Because his wife dies.
The children will die.
Children die.
The cat.
His wife does not die. But I think it's just important to realize he says using the voice of conscience to strengthen himself against the external forces that are coming against him.
Cattle die, he's covered in boils.
Yeah, and his friends are making fun of him because they think he must have done something to deserve this, right? So he's like taken to the bottom of reality, but he refuses to lose faith. Now, you might say, and this is where the story, I think, transcends something like mere rationality, but we can argue about that. You might say that the logical conclusion from that misadventure is that Job has every rational reason to shake his fist at the sky and curse God, right? But he doesn't. he maintains faith in the goodness of being despite the fact that he's suffering dreadfully.
Yeah.
And
this is where I think this is a good place to start with the book of Job. So I'm not saying that it's not a major critique, but this is where, like, the book of Job seems to be, for a lot of people, including myself, and so I'm included in this, a little bit of a mirror, or a little bit of something that you can project something onto that will it's a little bit of a, I don't even know what you'd call it, a workbench where you can throw some of your own stuff on there and see how it plays out. And so, like, Peterson, like I said in the earlier Maps of Meaning, was playing with the Tiamat Marduk story, which definitely is relevant as far as ancient cosmology and why God is speaking about Leviathan at the end. But then, well, let me just rewind here for a second and play back what Peterson just said.
Uses that internal guide of conscience, which was now, say, allied with the voice of God in some sense, against these terrible external forces that are conspiring to bring him down, right? Because his wife dies.
The children will die.
Children die.
The cattle die. He's covered in boils.
Yeah, and his friends are making fun of him because they think he must have done something to deserve this, right? So he's like taken to the bottom of reality. But he refuses to lose faith. Now, you might say, and this is where the story, I think, transcends something like mere rationality, but we can argue about that. You might say that the logical conclusion from that misadventure is that Job has every rational reason to shake his fist at the sky and curse God, right? But he doesn't. He maintains faith in the goodness of being, despite the fact that he's suffering dreadfully.
Yeah.
So he maintains faith in the goodness of being. So this is where I think Peterson's bringing a little bit of this idea of always having to believe in the goodness of being, which I don't think is necessarily that Job loses faith in the goodness of being, but he definitely struggles with it, with the question, is it actually good? And that's a different thing than to maintain a faith in it. He really does struggle because in his lament, at least in chapter 3, he doesn't want everything to go away, but he wishes he was never born. And the language he uses and the types of things he says is the language of uncreation, unmaking. It's not just, I wish I was dead. It's like, I wish I was never made. And so there's this rolling back of time and this swallowing up of the past and of his own being. Now, he's doubting the goodness of his own being. Now, there's this sort of move where he's not necessarily lashing out at the world, but he is saying that his own life has become meaningless and void, and he even says, I loathe my life. There's an author, I forget who it was. He wrote a book on Job that goes through, it's basically a commentary, but he talks in there about how Job loses faith. It's not like everything collapses and he's like, oh, life's no good anymore. I don't want to live. Life used to be good, now it's not, and now I'm sad. The collapse that happens undoes the meaning that was there when the times were good. Like, this is a metaphysical collapse of all meaning across all of Job's life. So he doesn't even see the purpose of what was good before. And so, you know, this is where I would be a little more nuanced, or where I am being more nuanced about this than Peterson is, but let's continue here and see what he has further to say.
Yeah.
And see,
despite what the voice from the whirlwind says to him, which is the least comforting thing that the voice could say, which is, who are you to question the Lord thy God?
Right. But this is such an interesting issue here, because I've watched people in the deep throes of misery, and I can tell you that one of the things that will make misery hell is ingratitude. And so part of the story of Job seems to me to be
I think this is another Peterson hobby horse about gratitude. I mean, there is something to say about it. I don't think it's that clear, like within the text, that Job is being grateful.
An injunction that is no matter what happens to you, and that means in some sense, no matter the facts at hand, that you are called upon never to lose faith in the essential goodness of being, right? To conduct.
Yeah, and here's where I think Peterson's overstating the point, especially I think he overstates the point generally, and then also just in the book of Job, what we see is a man who has almost lost faith in the goodness of being, and he demands an answer. So it's not like Job has come to a conclusion that being is terrible and worthless. For him, God needs to answer for it. And this is sort of where Job puts his faith. He doesn't put his faith in the goodness of being. He puts his faith in God, that God can justify it somehow because it's being is terrible, or being at least involves these terrors. So there's this heartbreaking part. I think it's in chapter 10, where Job says, you knit me together in my mother's womb. You breathed life into me. You raised me. You protected my spirit and created me. And then he says, but this you hid in your heart. And he's referring to all the disasters. You hid this from me, and now you've crushed me and utterly destroyed me. And so for Job, the question of being is at this point completely tragic. To the point where he again, then he'll say, I loathe my life. I wish I was never born. Why did you bring me out from the womb? And to the what Peterson is talking about here, this sort of belief in the fundamental goodness of being is kind of a Stoic. I think it's more of a Stoic concept, or a Stoic stance. Whereas Job is completely fallen apart, and he's almost going to give up. But he kind of finds a foothold in a couple things. One is that God, if he is just and righteous, has to answer me because I am innocent. Or because of his own integrity, he realizes that God has to answer him, which is an amazing thing to discover. So he has that, and then he also he maintains his integrity. So and simply put, I think the friends want him to lie and repent, admit to wrongdoing. And Job refuses to, and he even says stuff like, I will not lie for God, or do you want me to lie for God? And he criticizes his friends as being partisans for God, trying to get, because they're afraid because of what happened to Job, and now they're trying to cozy up to God because they're scared, not because of what he basically says that you're not serious about what you're saying, you're just scared. And Job has fear, but he also wishes he was buried away, so he doesn't hold back and he complains. So let's continue here. There's a little bit more left.
Yourself as if what would you say, the cosmos itself is well structured despite the evidence that happens to be being presented to you within the confines of your life. And I think that's the same as
all right. This is so he said being is good, believe in the fundamental goodness of being, and that the cosmos is constructed well despite the evidence that it's obviously a giant mess. This brings up something I want to go to now. Well, I think there's a little bit more, and then we'll go to this clip of Zizek.
I think that's the same as the practice of gratitude.
I'd agree. By the way, bring that to rather maybe
okay, so Peterson connects this to gratitude, and that's interesting. I don't quite get it, but I don't understand a lot of things. Okay. This is an older video from Slavoj Zizek. It's from a conversation he has with this guy, Jack Miller. I don't know who he is. But it's about 11 years old here on YouTube. And this is one of my favorite Zizek conversations. And let me just play a couple parts of this, and I'll try to edit it so that it doesn't go too long. But it has to do with what Peterson was saying there at the end about the cosmos is well ordered. So let me.
For me, the key was always the book of Job, which I think, if you permit me to say this, it will sound a provocation, but I mean it extremely seriously in an engaged way, is the first great work of critique of ideology. If I were to do, like the best of critique of ideology, forget about Marx, Freud, let's begin with the book of Job. Why? Are you aware what a tremendous thing happens there?
So in case you couldn't understand him, he sees Job as the first, the best critique of ideology, the first and best critique of ideology. And I assume this is, the friends are being ideologues, and Job is speaking the honest truth from how he sees it, his perspective.
We know. Let's forget about that stuff. I think it doesn't matter, that comical part at the beginning, how they have a nice evening lunch together, God and devil, and they debate that. But what happened there is that, okay, things go terribly wrong for Job. And then ideology enters. The 3 or 4 theological friends come, remember, and each of them tries to convince Job that there is a deeper meaning to his suffering. The point is not that he's guilty or not. The point is that, the first one says, even if you think you did nothing wrong, God is just, so you must have done something wrong without knowing it. The other guy says, God is just testing you, blah, blah. And I think the greatness of Job is that he doesn't say, I'm innocent. He just insists, no, all these catastrophes that fell on me have no meaning. And then occurs the first miracle. God comes, you remember, and says, every word that you, Job, said is true. He totally dismisses any justification. theological, and then comes the crucial point. Well, I follow my beloved Gilbert Keith Chesterton. Then, nonetheless, Job asks God, okay, but I put it in popular term, but let's cut the crap. Nonetheless, why did all this happen to me? Then, for me, I wonder how you would react to it. I'm here on Chesterton's side. It's the big enigma. That answer by God, where were you when I was creating these, that, monsters, is usually read as an extreme arrogance of God, emphasizing the infinite gap that separates us from God's total perspective. Like, who are you, a tiny piece of shit, even knowing that? Chesterton does something which is for me so shockingly simple but profound. He turns around the perspective, and God's answer is for Chesterton that is the following one. You think you are in trouble, but look at the entire universe that I created. It's all one big mess. Everything goes wrong and so on. That in a refined way, like God expresses his perplexity at his own creation. I think that this is maybe an incredible ethical revolution, because this is already the first step out of this traditional pagan view where justice means you should be at your own place, do your particular duty, and so on and so on. This withdrawal, which then I think culminates in the death of Christ.
Okay, so I love Zizek. And I don't think Chesterton says that in his essay. I don't think that's Chesterton's view. So that Zizek is saying he's going along with Chesterton. Chesterton does say this in reference to when God talks about the ostrich, and there is something like this in the text in Job where because God says, look at the ostrich. Basically, she's kind of dumb. She lays her eggs out in the open. She doesn't take good care of her young, and it says, God is saying this. He says, her creator did not make her with very much wisdom. And you're like, why is God talking about her creator? Like, God, you're her creator. What do you mean? And so in this, like Chesterton says like God seems for a moment perplexed. I think he says something like that. You're perplexed by his own creation with reference to the ostrich. But I love that it's just a surprising reading. Job, you think your life is messed up. Like, look at the rest of the universe. It's all a disaster. And, Job looking for some sort of order in the chaos is like, God sort of shrugs his shoulders and goes, it's a giant mess. I'm sorry. So there's something comical about that, but that I just wanted to play that in contrast to Peterson's sort of stoic thing of like the willful belief in the orderedness of creation despite my own limitations or despite my own how things appear to me. So we'll end it there, and hopefully I'll be doing more of these, and I'll see you guys later.